It is, no, it's always a blast to be here at Great Lakes. Last time I was in Kenosha, I was bailing Dave out from jail. So, hey, this is a change of pace again, so it's awesome. So glad to be here with you guys. Absolutely love Great Lakes Church, and just want to take a moment and welcome all of you guys at our Kenosha campus, our Racine campus, all you who watch online, and the Weekend on Wednesday crowd. I love it. Man, I love it. A few weeks ago, I was talking to Dave, and I said, what is this summer series that you guys, what series are you still in right now? And he goes, we're still Unstuck. I said, well, you've been unstuck for like 2 months. No wonder you're calling me twice in one summer, right? Oh, it's good. Now, I'm so excited to kind of be here with you guys and talking about something that's near and dear to my heart as well. And as you know, the heart behind this series has been all about learning how to take some steps towards change and transformation. And this entire series was built off of a key verse found in 2 Corinthians. And if you know it, you can kind of read along with me. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says, anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life has gone and the new life has begun. Isn't that good? Man, every time I read that verse, which is usually when I come to Great Lakes Church, right? Every time I'm going, this is fantastic. This is such a great promise. You see, the plan of Jesus has always been to help you and I grow and to change and to move towards transformation. And so today we're going to talk about what it kind of looks like on how to get unstuck. And I know you've covered a lot of ground throughout the summer. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like to get unstuck from relationships. Now, looking at me, you're going to say, what in the world does this guy have to say about relationships? And so what I usually bring with me to prove that I know what I'm talking about is a picture of my wife. All right, and so this is my beautiful family here. This is Amy and my oldest son, Oliver, my middle daughter, Violet, and our youngest is Willow. And before you even say it, I get the jokes all the time. I hear it, and let me just tell you, she married up. She totally did. No, I'm kidding. Mail order brides, they just work. They do. They work. So, but before we get too far, I'm going to share some stuff about relationships, but here's kind of the problem. In all seriousness, I need all the help I can get when it comes to relationships. I think a lot of us can, right? We don't understand this. We struggle, and life hits us pretty fast. You put a couple of demon kids in your life, and all of a sudden you're like, man, marriage, what do we do here? It's crazy. So we could use all the help we can get in relationships. And I don't have all the answers. In fact, I'll tell you a dirty little secret about what's happening in our life right now. Today is my 15th wedding anniversary. 15 years. Yes. Yeah. Super excited. I'm glad you're excited because my wife was not excited when I forgot to tell her that I'll be in Kenosha speaking on our 15th wedding anniversary, right? So here's the really good news. Everything I'm going to give you about advice for relationships doesn't come from me. It's found in God's word, and that's something that can speak to all of us. And so that's kind of what we're going to jump into and talk about. And relationships can be hard, right? If you're in them. And it doesn't matter if it's a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, even if it's just someone in your family that you know that you're building a friendship with, or in your neighborhood, and you're just trying to figure out how to become friends and how do we build relationships with coworkers, you name it. Relationships on any level can be hard. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I remember when I was dating my wife, Amy, we had actually gone out a couple of times. And I went to her house to pick her up, and it was kind of in the wintertime, so the sun was down. It was very dark out. It was cold, and she lived in this house where we had to walk like what seemed to be a quarter mile down the driveway. All right, it's like 30 feet, but to me, it's the same thing. It really is. So I had Amy with me, and we're kind of walking along. I had to park on the street, and I'm kind of walking towards the car. And you ever had that moment where you just hear and you see something out of the side of your eye, and like the spidey senses go off, and you're like, something's not right. I was walking Amy to our car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this figure moving towards us, right? There was no street lights. It was dark out, and I hear this scraping along the side. And I panicked. I'm thinking, what am I going to do here? And so the very first thing that came to my mind was I grabbed Amy, and I pushed her towards the sound. And I ran to my car. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, What my wife saw when she was pushed in the direction of the murderer was an elderly woman taking her garbage to the street. Right? And let me just say, there's no recovering from that. She just got in the car and she looked at me and I'm like filled with shame. Like, I know, I promise it can get better from here. We can make it. Don't give up on me. We were stuck and we had been dating 3 weeks. So there is hope that we can turn this thing around, right? Here's the thing when it comes to relationships, right? We all want what we want when we want it. We always look out for ourselves. That's the reality of just about any dynamic and any friendship and any relationship. There is this natural pull to always look out for yourself. And you carry that into every relationship dynamic that you have, including your marriage. And I would love to tell you that you outgrow this when you become an adult, but we all know that you don't. In fact, I bet you don't have to go very far back into your memory to remember the last time self-centeredness and selfishness kind of reared its ugly head in a situation or a season in your life. We're all self-centered people on some level. And that's one of the biggest things that makes relationships so challenging. Right? And I bet in a church our size, that is as big as we are, there are some of you, it has moved past feeling challenging to maybe even it starts to feel hopeless. Maybe the relationship that you're in just starts to feel a little bit desperate. There's a phenomenal book written by an author and a pastor and a Christian counselor. His name's Gary Chapman. And he wrote a book about how to distinguish the best way to communicate to the people that you love. And he does a lot of research and he meets with thousands and thousands of couples. And based on some of their understandings about relationship, he wrote another book called Desperate Marriages. And if you have ever looked at your season or your relationship and you go, I feel like I'm hopeless, I don't even know where to go, I would encourage you to find that book. It's called Desperate Marriages by Gary Chapman. In this book, he says, here's what happens. Most couples, when they find themselves in a situation that they feel is kind of hopeless or desperate, they start to believe 4 myths about the relationship. And I'll give them to you really fast, then you don't have to buy the book. It's really simple. He says this, that most people who find themselves in a relationship where it's challenging and it kind of moves to the place of maybe hopelessness or desperate, he says they end up believing 4 myths. Here's the first one. The first myth is that they believe that my environment will determine my emotion, right? In other words, this is my life. I can't do anything about it. This is my season. This is my situation, and it controls how I feel. He said the second myth that people believe when they're in a situation that they feel is hopeless is they start to believe this lie that people cannot change. You ever been there before? You go, this is just who they are. He's always been that way. She's always been that way. That's just the way it's always going to be. And they believe this myth that people cannot change. And I would bet that there's some of you, you're in situations right now, and you're believing that myth as well. And so before we go any further, can I just tell you, you are sitting in a room with hundreds and hundreds of people who have been changed by the mercy of God, the goodness of God. And no matter what you're enduring or walking through right now, it's not hopeless. And he says, here's another one. This is a myth that I find all the time that people believe. When they find themselves in kind of a desperate or hopeless situation, they think, I only have 2 choices when it comes to my situation. Either I get divorced or I break up, or I have to just live with a miserable marriage. They feel like there is no plan. There's nothing we're going to be able to do. This is always going to be the way it is. And when I look at my circumstance, I think these are the only 2 options I really have. He said the last one that people actually believe, and he says it comes up all the time in counseling, is that they are convinced that their situation is hopeless and that there's no possible way this could ever turn itself around. And so here's what I want to do. Before we get kind of any further today, I want you to hear me. With all of my heart, I believe this. I've experienced this. I've seen this to be true. That God is the God of hope. He is the God of the impossible, right? And when you surrender and you let God take over some things in your heart and your life, there is no telling what God can do. And so here's what we're going to do. I want to talk about how we can trade in some of those myths, some of those lies that we believe when we get stuck in our relationships for this truth. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Here's the big idea. If you give God 100% influence over 50% of your relationship, you can change the one that you can. Right? If you give God 100% influence over 50% of your relationship, you can change the one you can. Here's what I mean. As you begin to let God change you, it is going to begin to change the way that you see your relationship. It's going to change the way you see your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your spouse or your environment or your hopeless situation. Right? And so let me just say the most important thing when I counsel young couples, older couples, couples my age, you name it, one of the most important things that I help them understand is this. In the context of relationships, you can't change anybody. You can't change anybody, right? And there's a lot of people I know who knew the situation they were getting into wasn't a good one, but they were convinced that a few years with this, and I'll have them whipped into shape. I know this because they've sat in my office going, I just wish I had known that there's no way I can actually change somebody else. That is the most important thing for you to understand in the context of any relationship that you have, whether it's with your children, whether it's with a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, a friend, you name it. You can't change anybody, but you can allow God to change you. And see, as God changes you, it begins to impact how you see everything else. There's a great chapter in Matthew chapter 7. And Jesus was teaching what's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's the most famous sermon that Jesus ever gave. And he talks all about these truths and what it means to be a part of living in this kingdom life of God. And he's sharing some stuff in this chapter that I bet a lot of us have probably heard before. But what I want to do is I want to read some of this to you again today. And I want you to think of it from a different angle. I want you to think about this story we're going to read in Matthew chapter 7 from the angle and the standpoint of relationships and marriage. If you have a Bible, you can turn it with me. If not, you can follow the words. We'll put them on the screen. Matthew chapter 7, he starts this way in the sermon, verse 1. He says, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging others is the standard by which you will be judged." Right now, we don't like to admit this, but we can often assume the worst about the person that we're in a relationship with, right? If you're anything like me, you know what begins to happen. You begin to connect the dots with their behavior to their motives, and you start to create some storylines in your mind, and oftentimes you can kind of begin to assume the worst about them. Your imagination starts to run wild. Right, my wife Amy and I, as I said, we're going on 15 years of marriage, and we have had our fair share of knockdown, drag-out fights. But once the dust starts to settle, we almost always discover that somewhere along the line, one of us began to assume we knew what the other person should have thought or said or done. It was that assumption that kind of ruined that conversation. And when those assumptions aren't communicated, it goes to some pretty unhealthy places. We start to think, well, man, if he really loved me, he wouldn't have done that. If she really cared about me, she would have done this. If they understood, and we go to these places where all of a sudden we let our assumptions determine their motives. And we start to connect these dots, and our imagination goes to crazy, crazy places. And when we do that, right, we move to a place where we start to make some judgments that may be different from reality. And here's what I've discovered in the context of relationships. Our assumptions always lead to judgment, and judgment leads to disappointment. Right? Our assumptions have a way of leading straight to judgment, right? And judgment leads to disappointment, right? Maybe we had some expectations about someone, and they just didn't meet up to it. And so all of a sudden, we started creating a storyline, some judgments, and we were all of a sudden discontent or disenfranchised with the relationship. We were disappointed, right? Your expectations that you carry into relationships are often based on assumptions that we make with each other. Now, I'll give you a great example. Every Christmas, there are millions and millions of wives who go into Christmas thinking their husband is going to surprise them with something they actually like. Right? They have an expectation that my husband has listened to me, that he actually pays attention to what I wear, that he's going to know exactly what it is that I like. Yet every Christmas, there are millions and millions of heartbroken women that fake a smile on Christmas Day. Now, guys, we think we're killing it, right? We're like, no, it's the dress barn. They got everything, right? I mean, we'll be fine. You'll be great, right? Everyone loves a good kimono, right? So we're sitting there with some excitement like, oh, I bet she's going to start crying in front of the kids. Right? She opens the gift. You ladies have been there, right? We get it. We think it. Now, here's what I want to tell you. A couple of years ago, I stumbled upon something that has changed the trajectory of my marriage. The fact that I only have 3 kids is a miracle. I should have way more than that with this kind of relationship goal. Here's what I did. I took my wife Christmas shopping. That was it. We walked into a store and I said, what do you want? Like, you tell me what you like. And she's like, really? I'm like, yeah, you picked the stuff that you like. I'll come back later on and I'll buy it, right? And she's like, well, that's really not that fun. I'm like, have the last 15 Christmases been fun? No, let's figure this out, right? So she went step by step. She's like, I like this, I like this, I like this. And can I tell you, I went back and I bought all the different things that she liked, and she opened it up on Christmas, and it was the best Christmas of her entire life. Why? Because she helped a brother out, right? She told me what she was thinking. I didn't have to make any assumptions that I knew what the latest fashion trend was, right? I didn't have to make any judgment calls. She wasn't worried. She walked me through it. And you know what we've done since then? We create a Pinterest board, and she just puts it on there, and it's fantastic. And I'm like, this is great. This is the best thing ever. She's like, well, what do you want? I'm like, just you. Doesn't need anything. Don't need anything. Yeah, none of those clothes. Don't worry about it. That's fine. Right? This is great. Why? Because we have these assumptions that we carry into it. And when those assumptions or expectations aren't met, it leads to disappointment. It happens for all of us. Right? And so here's the danger. When you start assuming things about each other, you know what begins to happen? The day comes along when you're just tired, right? You're frustrated, you're having a bad day, you're not feeling connected, and all of a sudden you begin to connect some dots in your mind that never needed to be connected, right? You start to create a storyline in your head that feels true to you, but it's a really dangerous place to go in your mind. Right? Jesus knew that we all have this tendency to assume and to create storylines, right? To go to places in our head without all the facts, without all the details. We just create these storylines. Jesus knew that we had this tendency. And so this is why I said, listen, don't judge. In fact, be careful, because the standard you hold someone to is the standard that you are going to be held to, right? Because assumptions can lead to judgments. Right, which leads us to connecting dots that are simply not true. And when you do that, it leads to creating some unrealistic expectations and creating some serious disappointment. Right? And so if I could just give you anything that to say, if you don't pay attention to anything else I say, this piece of relationship advice has changed my marriage. It's changed me on how I navigate all the relationships that I have in my life. And it's this: assume the best interpretation of their actions possible. Start there. Start by always assuming the best interpretation of someone else's actions, unless you're absolutely proven different. Isn't that good? Think about what changes with that bitterness that kind of creeps in that we all carry when we're disappointed because someone didn't meet up our expectations. Whether it's a friend or a coworker or a spouse, imagine how it would shift just in you if you just started assuming the best interpretation of their actions, right? Because if you were going to get unstuck from relationships, you have to start here. You have to start here. If you want to stop making these assumptions and feeling like you're constantly disappointed because other people aren't meeting up, you've got to start here, right? And so here's what I want to do in the little time that we have left. I want to give you 3 really super practical things. It's found in this chapter, Matthew 7, that I think Jesus intended for stuff that was well beyond the scope of this message, right? And so if you're taking notes, here's kind of what I want you to understand. If you want to give God 100% influence over 50% of your relationship and change the one you can, you have to start here. Here's the first one. Give and you'll receive, right? Give and you'll receive, right? We oftentimes want to flip that around, right? We want to receive, then we want to give. But Jesus kind of challenges us to give and then receive. In the Gospel of Luke, he records this exact same conversation, but he shares some more details than Matthew did in the passage that we just read. Luke described it this way. He says, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Right? Do not condemn others, or it will all come back against you. He says, forgive others, and you will be forgiven. Give, and you will receive. Right? Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make more room, running over, and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine, listen to this, the amount you get back. Right? And I think if you've ever heard this passage before, you've heard people teach it in the context of giving in their resources, right? And we hear pastors say, listen, you want God to bless you? You just need to just send us that money, and God is going to give back to you more than you've ever dreamed, right? We think of it in terms of financial return, right? That as we trust God with what we have and we sow generously, that God is going to bless that. But here's what I want you to understand. The principle of sowing and reaping is so much bigger than just money, right? What Jesus is saying is when you give, right? When you give grace, when you give mercy, when you give kindness and joy and love, it has a way of coming back to you, right? And this isn't karma. It's called the principle of sowing and reaping, right? And so let's think in the context of relationship. If you plant, right? If you plant negativity and anger and emotional withdrawal, manipulation in your relationship, eventually you are going to receive back a whole lot of relational dysfunction, right? But listen, if you plant love and kindness and grace and mercy and forgiveness and assuming the best in each other, then eventually you're going to receive back more of that kind of stuff in your relationship. And here's the thing, God always blesses that, right? You know why? Because as a follower of God, you are not just serving that person, you're actually serving God. And as you do that, you learn that you first receive from God, and then you pass that on to other people. And if you want to get unstuck, you're trying to figure out how to motivate some things in your marriage, your relationship again, start here. Give, and then you'll receive. Here's the next thing Jesus begins to say. You want to change the one you can? Remove the log. Remove the log. Right? Give, and then you'll receive. Remove the log. See, Jesus goes on to give this fantastic analogy, and it's important because all of us are pretty good at seeing weakness in others. We just can't always see it in ourselves. And so in the very next verse, look at what Jesus says. He says, why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Can you imagine all the couples in the room listening to Jesus explain this? Right, this is that point in the message where the husband starts squirming in their seat, and they're like, I gotta go to the bathroom, I'm getting up. Right, and the wife's like pulling like, you sit your butt down. Right, you sit down, right? Jesus knows how we are, right? And so he says, man, I want you to consider this, right? Some translations may say, I want you to contemplate. I want you to give some reflection about the log in your own eye. Don't try to be so quick to fix someone else's mess. when you have a pretty big one of your own. Now, think about that in the context of relationships. I am not saying that you don't have to share truth and confront and challenge each other, especially if you're a spouse. That is one of God's greatest gifts to helping you become more like Christ. See, oftentimes we think following Jesus and things like marriage and the benefit of being a Christ follower is about your happiness. It's not. It's about your holiness. God is using people in and around you to shape you to become more like Christ. So I'm not saying we don't have conversations or we don't confront, but some of us are excellent at turning the spotlight off of us and back onto someone else so that we don't have to deal with our crap. And it is one of the biggest reasons why people get stuck in relationships. And so Jesus is saying, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you take care of what's going on the inside first? Talk about it with each other. Change the one that you can. And trust that God is big enough to take care of your heart and the heart of others. Because when that happens, when you give God 100% influence over 50% of your relationship, you can begin to change the one that you can. And you begin to see things differently, right? And so what Jesus is saying is, listen, before you make accusatory statements, why don't you take some time to kind of self-reflect and consider what might be driving those thoughts, those feelings, those behaviors, right? Because Jesus understood that when we give something a little self-reflection, so often we begin to realize that some of this is actually just our own issues. And this is what I love about Jesus. In Matthew 7, he is giving relationship gold out to all who will listen. Can you imagine how different your relationships would look like? If you've been married for a long time, you've got a history of things to kind of go back and read through the playbook and look at the conversations and where it went wrong. Could you imagine how different some of those things would have worked out if before you lunged into a conflict, you took a few minutes to just reflect, figure out what was really driving it? I can't tell you how many times I come home and my kids or my wife get to bear the brunt of my bad day. Had nothing to do with them. And if I just slowed down enough to realize that I had some stuff going on, it may have caused a whole lot more peace in our home. Jesus says, give and you'll receive. Remove the log. Here's the last thing. Jesus says it, Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. If you're taking notes, is this: live the golden rule. You want to get unstuck? Give and receive. Remove the log. Live the golden rule. In Matthew 7, verse 12, this is a verse that Jesus shared. In fact, we have shared this many times with kids. And isn't it funny when it comes to the principles of God, we can teach these to our kids and ignore them as adults? He said in Matthew chapter 7, do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets, right? The golden rule is what we call Matthew chapter 7, 12, right? To say, listen, if you had to follow one thing to help you get unstuck in life, this is a pretty good one to start with. He said, make that the top line. If you want something to be done to you, that's what you do. He says, whatever you would like them to do to you, right? And what makes the golden rule so powerful is that it's proactive. Right? It's not just something that we teach to our kids and ignore as we become adults. Here's the thing. You are never going to outgrow God's truth. It's always going to be something good for you to be reminded of. And up until this point in history, philosophers, teachers, rabbis, they shared this rule. This wasn't something unique to Jesus, right? There wasn't like hundreds of people in the crowd going, oh, I'm going to tweet that. That is fantastic, Jesus. Right? This was something that they had heard their entire life. In fact, generations, philosophers and teachers, they all taught the rule, but they shared it in the negative. And what that means is they would say, do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you, right? Because we're always interested in self-preservation, right? So Jesus comes along and he turns it all the way upside down. He says, no. You go and do first, without any expectation of return, and see what begins to happen. That's how you get unstuck. That's how you live a good life. And think about that as it applies to relationships. Right? Do you like it when someone compliments you? right? Do you like it when someone goes above and beyond to honor you, to serve you, right? To take on extra responsibilities, right? Do you like it when they take you on a surprise date or they pick up something nice? If you like it, go and do it. Consider what you like and consider what they like and then do it for them. That is the way of Jesus. That is what turned the whole culture of what it meant upside down when Jesus came and he disrupted people's way of thinking. He said, life isn't just about you. I want you to look outward. I want you to go and do what you would want people to do to you in return. Right? And I know there's some of you single guys going, I'm going to just start making out with everybody because that's what I want in return. Right? Yeah. Good luck. Give it a whirl. Give it a whirl. When you're arrested, just say, my pastor Dave told me this is totally acceptable. Totally acceptable. Right? Isn't this good? Jesus in Matthew 7 says, man, I know what it is like to get in a rut, to get stuck in your relationship. And so let me just give you some advice. Let me give you some help. Give, then receive. Remove the log. Deal with some stuff on your own before you lay into somebody else. And ultimately, you want to turn your relationship around? Live the golden rule. Do for somebody else what you would hope they would do for you. That's how you give God 100% influence over 50% of your relationship, and you change the one that you can. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking like, this is the worst relationship talk I've ever heard. Like, I wanted to hear something like, 5 keys to having a blissful life in marriage. Just do this and everything will be great, right? 5 keys to stirring up the romance in my relationship. Trust me, you start changing the one that you can, romance will come trickling after. See, God's desire for all of us is to live in intimacy with him, and then out of that fullness, experience love and intimacy with each other. You see, you've probably heard it said that any 2 fools can fall in love. Staying in love is the hard part. But after 15 years, what I've experienced is staying in love, it's the best part. God has more for you than what you settle for. Step into it. Experience it. Can I pray with us today? God, thank you for who you are. Thanks for what you're doing in Great Lakes Church. Thanks for the tools that you give us in the Word of God that says, hey, you can get through today. We'll worry about tomorrow. I'll bring some people around you, but you have what you need to get through today. I'm with you. So God, I pray for everyone in this room that's in a relationship of any kind. I ask that you would give them exactly what their heart needs today. That you would help people to be brought back in relationship with each other. You would restore marriages, restore friendships, and you would allow people to experience what it really looks like to live a relationship that brings honor and glory to God. We thank you for it, God. Thanks for helping us get unstuck. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.